Abraham's riches was as a result of the blessing that came from him having to leave everything. Abraham's name became great. It was a blessing that came from the first business deal. That was the call. If Abraham had not successfully gone through the first business deal, which was the call, he wouldn't have gotten to the second business deal, which is the promise. So now God promised him in Genesis 15 and said, I have a son for you. I will give you a son. And do you know what the demand in the promise was? The demand was that Abraham should believe God. Genesis chapter 15 was where God promised Abraham a son. When God told Abraham to leave his father's house, he didn't promise him a son. There are certain things he promised Abraham, and he said, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless him and make his name great so that he will be a blessing. And God did all of that. Even before the son came, God kept this part of the promise to Abraham. Because going down in, I think, verse 14 or so, verse 14 to 15, going down to that verse, let me be sure. Yes, verse 13, chapter 13, verse 2. The Bible says Abraham was now rich. Abraham's riches was as a result of the blessing that came from him having to leave everything. Abraham's name became great. It was a blessing that came from the first business deal. That was the call. If Abraham had not successfully gone through the first business deal, which was the call, he wouldn't have gotten to the second business deal, which is the promise. So now God promised him in Genesis 15 and said, I have a son for you. I will give you a son. And do you know what the demand in the promise was? The demand was that Abraham should believe God. Abraham didn't have to do anything. The demand for the second business deal was believe. Believe in the things I have said and you will see the manifestation. I will do it. That was what God said to Abraham. But now listen, the second business deal didn't go very well, right? There was a little problem. Permit me, I may not even call it, I shouldn't even call it a little problem. It was a major problem that we still face today. Abraham breached the second business deal. God said all you need to do for the second business deal was to believe, and Abraham tried to help God. My question to you today is, are you currently going through a business deal with God and all he has asked you to do is believe, but you want to actually do something to help him? There are certain times where Jesus would ask you to do something. There are certain times where he would ask you to do nothing. The problem is that the business deal was one of the business deals that God said, do nothing. Just believe. Alright, just believe. The deal was the promise of a son. The demand was for Abraham to believe. In chapter 16, Abraham faced an obstacle and tried to help God. Now, when God promised him a son, immediately, chapter 16, he promised him a son, made a business deal with him in chapter 15. In chapter 16, we were hearing about the barrenness of his wife, Sarai. And Abraham was worried. He said, you cannot promise me a son. Ask me to believe. And then chapter 16, we're hearing that Sarah was barren. I think some scripture said the Lord shut Sarah's womb. And Sarah had no child. Alright, the Lord shut her womb. She was barren. And then Abraham tried to help God. And we saw Ishmael coming into the picture. And Ishmael was not the product of belief. Ishmael was a product of work. So every time you go out of belief, you try to help God, you put yourself in trouble. Sometimes we pay heavily for unbelief. We repeat a class over and over and over and over again. The business deal is never sealed because of unbelief. Now we see how that Abraham saw the mess he had gotten into and he repented. But there was something for me that stood out in the business deal of the promise, and I'll share it with you at the end of this video, so you have to stay to the end. It is profound. I'm telling you, it is going to wow you and bless you. All right. So don't think that that deal was not properly sealed. I'll show you something later on by the end of this video. So the next business deal God went in with Abraham was the covenant. Is the deal of the covenant, and we see that in Genesis chapter 17. All right. So like I said, this is talking about the covenant of circumcision. The demand was for Abraham to circumcise every male of his house. And he went further to say, Sarai, your wife, will bear a son. That was what the Lord was saying to Abraham, and he said, you will circumcise this boy. So we're talking about the third business deal, which is the deal of the covenant, where God goes into a covenant with you and you do something to seal that covenant. Usually a blood is a symbol of covenants. All right, where you pierce yourself, you do something. The blood is a symbol of covenant. Nobody's saying you should pierce yourself now to go into a covenant with the Lord. But one key element of a covenant, remembrance every time, is the communion, where you have to drink the blood and eat his flesh. That is a deal. Every time you do that, Jesus remembers the covenant he has with you. He remembers the deal you have made. All right. So that's your part. That's what you do to seal this covenant, to activate the covenant, to activate this business deal. You take the communion. You take the communion. There's something I'll be sharing with you about the covenant by the end of this video. I have them all listed down and I'll come back to them. The fourth business deal God went into with Abraham is the sacrifice. And we see that in Genesis chapter 22. So for recap's sake, I'll go through the first business deal, which I call the call. And in the call, the demand was that Abraham would leave, and then he would leave his country, his people, his father's house. And the reward was that God is going to make his name great. And then we saw the second business deal, which is the promise. And then we say the promise was that Abraham should believe God. The demand was that Abraham should believe and God would give him a son. That was the reward. And then for the third business deal was the covenant. The covenant was enacted by a circumcision. Abraham will cut the foreskin, and the reward was that you will become my people. This is a seal that you are now my own. This is a sign that you are my own. All right. So the fourth business deal is the sacrifice. And we see that in Genesis 22. Like I said, God demanded a sacrifice. And God didn't just ask for anything. God asked for his son, Isaac. All right. This particular deal of a sacrifice was an oath. And brethren, my friends, at the fourth level of your dealings with God is where the entire deals are sealed. Now, for every point in Abraham's journey, God renewed or reminded him of the promise. But this time around, they came with a little more specification. So God said the first time, God told him, leave, I'll make you a great name, I'll do this, I'll do that. At the second point, when he got to the promise of the covenant, right, where he got to that promise in chapter 7, Genesis chapter 17, the terms had changed. God now said, walk before me blameless, because Abraham had gone to help him, had tried to help him, where he went in with Hagar. God said, okay, no, now I need to introduce a new term to these things I've said to you. Now you have to walk before me blameless. I didn't say that at first. I said, now walk before me blameless. By the time he was getting to the sacrifice, where he said, give me your son, God had upgraded the terms of the promise. And he said, God swore. It was a seal. Now he did not just, I will make you a great nation. I will do this. He swore. And he swore and said, let me read that for you. Genesis chapter 22. Okay, let's read from verse 15. And the angel of the Lord called upon Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declared the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely is also a swearing. I swear, surely I have sworn, I will bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. What God was doing all this while was to arrive at the sacrifice, the business deal called the sacrifice. So God started from the call, he went to the promise, he went to the covenant, and he arrived at the fourth one. These are four things God demands from every Christian, and they grow with time. So you can tell where you are at. the first demand from God is that you leave everything and follow Him. If you are still struggling with leaving something, you are at the first level of God's demand for your life, where you cannot leave your family, where something is standing in between you and God. You cannot leave your job. He's saying leave your job. You're saying no, I can't leave my job. If there is anything you are holding on to firmly than you are holding on to God, or you're holding on to Jesus, then you are still at the first stage of God's demand for every believer. You know, some people met Jesus and they say, Master, I want to follow you. And He said, go and sell the things you have. Leave those things and come. That was what Jesus was saying. And the man said, Kai, I can't. Those things are so precious to me. What exactly is more precious to you than God? What are you holding tight onto that you cannot leave to follow Him? Jesus is placing a demand on those things. Ask Him to help you. Help me choose you over everything else. Over marriage, over children, over a good job, over a car, over material thing, over money. Because a lot of us are chasing money and God cannot place a demand on it. He's placing a demand on it and we're like, no, we can't. All right. So the second demand of God from every believer is that you believe Him. You arrive at the place where you can choose, you can follow Him, you can let things go. But do you know that believing Jesus is one very hard thing that believers are finding it difficult to do? You know, I did a video and I think you should watch it. Believing in God versus believing God. Some of us believe in God, but we have not arrived at the place where we believe Him. When He says a thing, we believe it. So the first demand is that you leave everything, follow Him. The next demand is that you believe the very word that He speaks. Believe in the words that He speaks. That was one of the struggles of the disciples. Believing in the things that He was saying. One certain time they said, this is a hard saying. Who can believe it, right? So the third level, the third demand is circumcision. Circumcision is where you set a mark that all you have belongs to Him. Where you circumcised everything. You cut everything. You give a sign on everything that they belong to God. Now you are not just leaving things. You are giving Him those things. You arrive at the place where you live, you believe, and then now you circumcise, you consecrate everything you have for Him. That's what He's demanding also of every believer. Arrive at the place where what you have is no longer yours. It carries the mark of Jesus, especially your life. Where your life is not yours. You are not afraid of laying it down at His feet. You're not afraid of losing your life so that He would be glorified. Lastly, the fourth and the final demand of God for every believer is that you give Him your Isaac. You arrive at a place where you need to give God your best. Your best. Nothing short of your best. Nothing below your best. Your best time, your best money, your best thoughts, your best everything. Where you don't give Him leftover of your time, but you give Him your best. So these are the four things God is demanding. And when you arrive at the place where you have given Him your best, that is where the deal is sealed. Where you now commit to God your very best. Okay, you know, I said I was going to share something about the promise. All right, the promise where God promised Abraham His son and said, only believe. So this is what I want to share with you. Everything that God told Abraham, from the call to the promise, Sarai was not mentioned. Sarai was not. God never said anything to Abraham about Sarai. And then when God promised him a son, He said, I will give you a son. God didn't necessarily tell him how He was going to do it. Abraham just believed Him. Now, Abraham got to the point where I've been believing and I've not seen anything. In fact, the next chapter, this wasn't God saying. The next chapter said, now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no child. Up until that time, no child was coming forth from Sarai. And the scripture said, she had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And we know the story, how Sarai said to Abraham, all right, go into this, my maid, and she would give you a child. In their tradition then, it was right. Abraham his wife could actually give him, because she was the wife's property. The wife can say, okay, have this my maid as a concubine. Go into her, and whatever she brings forth is the wife's own, is the wife's child. It belongs to the wife. So that was Abraham and Sarai trying to help God, because I was sure Sarai was in the know of the dealings God was having with Abraham, or the business God was having with Abraham. Now this is where I'm going to. As God went further and saw that it's like this guy didn't get the concept, the entire thing that I was talking about, or that I am talking about, he went on in chapter 17. This was where, in the whole promise, in the whole interaction, that God ever mentioned Abraham's wife. And he said, and God said to Abraham, as for your wife Sarai, all right, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And he said, no, I didn't think this was what you were talking about. He laughed. And he said, I'm 100 years. And Sarah is 99. How, please? No. Abraham believed God. Sorry to say this. Abraham believed God because he didn't understand what God was talking about. From chapter 15, the Bible said Abraham believed God and was counted unto him as righteousness. Abraham didn't really understand. He thought God would give him a son from every other means, since Sarai was old and she couldn't bear a child. In fact, he even waited. Let's say he waited for a bit, because the next verse in chapter 16 says, now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no child. So they had waited and she had given birth to no child. And then Abraham thought, okay, at least I have this boy already. And he was going to become my heir. So this is what I'm saying. This is what I'm trying to drive home. That all through the journey of the business deal of the promise God made to Abraham, Sarai was not included, or Sarai's name was not mentioned. So Abraham actually thought God's promise of his son was not going to come from Sarai. It was going to come from any other means. And then when Sarai gave him Hagar, he thought this was the means. And then God said, no, you don't understand what I'm talking. The son I said I'm going to give you is going to come from this woman, Sarai. You're no longer going to call her Sarai, but Sarah. And Abraham laughed and fell to his face. I think we all need to understand that when it comes to believing God, you need to believe him entirely. In fact, some of the things he would ask you to believe are utterly impossible. They do not seem, you would actually think it would be easier, God, if you do it through this way. But this way, it's hard to believe. So that's what I thought I would share with you at the end of this video concerning the promise of a son that God made to Abraham. I want to really thank you for spending your time to watch this video. I hope this was a blessing to you. I hope really it was a blessing. Kindly like, subscribe, drop a comment, and let me know what stood out for you. And I'll see you in my next video. God bless you. Bye.